Our plan is simple. We can stop the spread by staying at home and reducing contact. Now is the time to act. We will move to level 4.
5 years and 1 day ago, the team of 5 million moved into one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world.
These decisions will place the most significant restrictions on New Zealanders' movements in modern history. This is not a decision taken lightly, but it is our best chance to slow the virus and to save lives.
And in that whole new world, we started to learn new words and phrases.
There is now officially a cluster of community transmission in New Zealand with 13 new...
Combating Delta in the community is like dealing with a whole new virus.
Build your bubble. Your bubble is like a protective shield to keep you safe from contact with COVID-19.
The entire country will move into the new traffic light system in 11 days' time.
The Soundsplash Music Festival could become a COVID super spreader event.
And the country experienced events that triggered fear and anxiety and anger.
The anger over an Auckland couple's trip to Wanaka continues to grow. An Auckland couple's illicit lockdown escape to a holiday home is being described by Wanaka locals as selfish and inexcusable.
Guests at a Bluff wedding, which has become one of the largest COVID-19 clusters in the country, say it's a day they'll never forget.
Well, with the protest at Parliament stretching into its third day, there are some concerns mounting it could become a super spreader event.
I'm Sharon Brett Kelly, and today on The Detail, our response to COVID and what happens next time. It's all in the report from the Royal Commission of Inquiry into COVID-19, lessons learned, the result of 2 years' work and thousands of submissions. So why has the government ignored it? Well, let's go back to that announcement of our first lockdown. At the time, Newsroom's senior political journalist Mark Dulder was already buried in stories about COVID.
I was at home that day. By then, I think Newsroom had already transitioned to sort of one person in the gallery office at a time rule. And so I wasn't attending that press conference itself, but I watched the press conference from home because, you know, it was the only thing that was happening.
Do you remember what was going through your head?
Yeah, because I was, had been for, a week and a half at that stage, so focused on COVID reporting. The lockdown announcement came after a period, a relatively short but very intense period of quite strenuous kind of lobbying and calls for a lockdown from just about everyone you could imagine. Obviously you had Michael Baker making the case for it, but you also had the business community calling for it. You had health workers saying they were worried about, going through the same thing that we'd seen in Italy and in Iran and in the United Kingdom. Everyone was calling on the government to do this. Even that morning, if I recall correctly, the National Party, Simon Bridges, had put out a press release saying, let's do a lockdown. And so it wasn't hugely surprising that it was happening, but processing what it meant, to some extent, I think that came later, well after the announcement, that you started to figure out, okay, what are our lives actually going to look like and for how long?
You've read this report from start to finish. Do you feel it's a good reflection of what went on?
Yeah. The Royal Commission report, the report from the first phase, I suppose I should say, it's long. It's 716 pages, including all the appendices and things, which I did read as well. It does an excellent job of summarising what happened. The COVID response was such a mammoth task that there are details that it doesn't get to. It overlooks long COVID in particular, but broadly, the report finds, the COVID response was a success. And it's not a whitewash. There are important failures, important missteps that the report highlights, including ones that were new to me despite having followed the COVID response so intimately for so long.
Such as?
Well, they have a very good section on that period in late 2021 when New Zealand transitioned from elimination to something else, and the government never really nailed how to describe the something else. And so when Jacinda Ardern came out on October 4th, 2021, announced this 3-step system for getting Auckland out of lockdown and kind of said that elimination was no longer the goal.
In fact, for this outbreak, it's clear that long periods of heavy restrictions has not got us to 0 cases. But that is okay. Elimination was important because we didn't have vaccines. Now we do. This is a change in approach we were always going to make over time. Our Delta outbreak has accelerated that transition.
The Royal Commission finds that happened after there had been no discussion behind the scenes about when to end elimination or what would replace it. They found that there were failures in that very good period that New Zealand had between the end of the first lockdown in June 2020 and the beginning of the long Auckland lockdown in August 2021, more than a year, where we could have been planning for, okay, once the vaccine comes, once you roll it out, what does our strategy look like then? And that really wasn't taken up as an opportunity. They found that during the pandemic there was no sustained increase in ICU capacity. Now ICU capacity is starting to grow, but it took far longer than it should have for the health system to be able to sort of scale up to deal with those things. And they found that some of the vaccine mandates went on too long. They said that when they were put in place originally, they were reasonable, they were sensible, understandable, but as they stretched into 2022, and particularly after the peak of the Omicron wave, that first one in sort of March 2022, it became less defensible. It became a much more fine balancing act about the benefits that these mandates had versus the costs that they were imposing on society.
As you say, it wasn't a whitewash, but why, when this report came out, which was the end of last year, why wasn't more made of it by the government and I guess maybe by the media?
There's one logistical reason, which is that normally when a Royal Commission report is received by the government, or any really big report like this, A, the government itself takes some time to digest it, and then B, they tend to provide it to media and other stakeholders in a sort of embargoed format, right? What happened instead was the minister received it and sight unseen sent it out to everyone. Entirely entitled to do that. But what it meant is that journalists suddenly have this 700-page report in their inbox, and they know that every other journalist and every other outlet is also racing to file something. So they hop into the document, they search up lockdown, they search up vaccine mandate, they pull some of the quotes, pop it into a story, and then the news cycle moves on. In terms of the government's perspective, they're still waiting for the phase 2 of the Royal Commission to report back. That's this sort of added-on bit that came out of the coalition agreements with ACT and New Zealand First, more narrowly tailored to looking at lockdowns, vaccine mandates, which the first phase looked at in quite some depth, but this will be even more depth, as well as the safety and efficacy. Fortunately, we know already the vaccines were safe, so I'm sure there's some useful and interesting information that will be produced by that, but we don't expect a commission in New Zealand to sort of overturn the scientific consensus on that subject. Nonetheless, the government's waiting for that to come back before they consider the recommendations of the first report. And so they've kind of put it on the shelf until February next year, which is when that second phase is due.
Are you saying that this government should be getting on to it sooner?
Absolutely. I mean, there are worrying signs. People are looking quite concernedly at H5N1, the bird flu, the avian influenza that's been spreading around the world since 2020, but particularly in the Americas where it has mutated to be able to spread between mammals. It's the first time that's ever happened with this particular strain of bird flu. And on the few cases where you have had the virus jump from animals into humans in the past, it's happened about 800 times in various poultry farm outbreaks and wet markets and so on. About half of the people who have caught the virus have died. So this is a really serious virus. Again, maybe it will never evolve to transmit between humans. Maybe it will just remain an animal concern, and that's bad enough, but it's quite different from a pandemic. So maybe not.
Yeah. So when you go to the minister in charge of this area?
Well, that's part of the difficulty. So Brooke Van Velden is the Internal Affairs Minister, and she's kind of in charge of this by virtue of it's the Department of Internal Affairs that kind of works alongside royal commissions. The first phase report, that came out in November, recommended that the government appoint a minister to handle pandemic preparedness and responding to the recommendations in the report. There are 39 of them, the recommendations. That hasn't happened yet because, again, the government has just kind of put its hands up. So it's not even clear who would be responsible for implementing these recommendations. But yes, I have put that particular question to Minister Van Velden saying, with H5N1, looking like a possible pandemic threat, given that all the experts are saying, hey, we really need to do this urgently. Even the authors of the report, the Royal Commissioners themselves, said there's nothing in their recommendations that can't be started right now, nothing that needs to wait for Phase 2. Phase 2 could be helpful, it could provide more information, it could change a little bit of what we're doing, but there's no reason to be waiting. I've put that all to the Minister, and she's basically said we want the full picture. Whatever else will come from Phase 2 before we make any decisions. And if you were doing a report on a one-time occurrence, maybe that would make sense, but again, we know a pandemic will happen, and we hope it won't happen soon, but we wouldn't want to be caught with our pants down if it did happen soon and we had the opportunity to be better prepared and just ignored it.
400 face-to-face meetings involving about 1,600 people. We processed, analysed 133,000 pages of evidence, and we received through our public portal 13,000 submissions.
Melbourne-based epidemiologist Professor Tony Blakely chaired the Royal Commission of Inquiry. He says the experience of travelling the country, talking to people, has left him with lasting impressions.
Travelling up and down the country, I got to know a lot about New Zealand. I'd lived in Rawene in the Hokianga for 15 months at one point in my life, so going back up there to visit people there was a blast from the past. But I didn't quite anticipate how much the pandemic affected some of those communities through mis and disinformation and isolation.
In what way?
I think if you look across the board, there were a lot of people who lost employment, often because of employers using the Health and Safety Act to require vaccine of their staff. And I think we saw more people in rural areas who didn't want to be vaccinated, who therefore were out of work for at least some period of time. You can also see that in those more rural areas, but it was again across the board, is that you've seen more absenteeism from school amongst kids that's continued. Those examples are really just examples of a much wider pattern, is that the pandemic essentially accelerated or exacerbated fault lines or inequalities that we knew in our society. So as another example, there's quite a stunning graph that I don't think's received much attention in New Zealand, but you can get it from the Ministry of Health, the Health Survey data, and it shows the psychological distress of New Zealanders over time. And the curve for 15 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds just goes up dramatically during the pandemic. It was going up anyway, and it's probably come back to where its trend was. But things like intergenerational inequalities and adverse mental health for young people, that is a worldwide phenomenon at the moment, was exacerbated by the pandemic.
I know, and that actually leads me to a question about the social impact. You could say economically, yes, we're on the road to recovery, but the social impact, do you think we'll ever get over that?
I view it slightly differently, and I think some people on emergency management, they talk about the difference between managing an emergency and a crisis. An emergency is something that hits you hard and then you try and return to pre-emergency normal. A crisis, like climate change, like a pandemic, a major pandemic, actually sees you shift to a new normal. So we are now in a new normal. We're not going back to the way it was before. We all do work from home more. We have different ways of functioning. So I think the question is that we are now different in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and around the world, and we're settling into a new normal.
You said last year that the findings of this Royal Commission may heal deep divisions. Do you feel that they have?
Find that hard to judge from this side of the Tasman. What I was hoping that our report would achieve is that by the 13,000 submissions we came in, by the fact that myself and John Whitehead and more recently Grant Illingworth and previously Hekia Parata, we took incredibly seriously the onus, the responsibility put on us under the Inquiries Act to be independent and impartial. So we've called it as we think it was. We've said that New Zealand did very well. There's no escaping that. But the wheels did get wobbly. And things like vaccine mandates, particularly those through workplace laws implemented by employers, went on too long and affected too many people adversely. We called that. We hope that by having said those types of things, people see that we've been honest and impartial, and it will help the healing going forward. So, for example, that leads into recommendations. And going forward into the next pandemic will be different from the last. It'll be a different virus, different fatality rate, different this, different that. But nevertheless, we would only use those mandatory measures if we really needed to next time. That's a lesson that we take out of the last pandemic. And that means that we need to have better preparation for the next pandemic. That means having investment in your public health workforce, for example, to be able to do good contact tracing, to have ESR being able to search genomic testing, to have all those things ready to go. At the moment, a lot of countries are struggling with deficits and economic downturn and cutting back the public sector, and that is pretty prominent in New Zealand at the moment, which does make me concerned about the preparedness of New Zealand for a future pandemic, but these things have to be weighed up against all the other priorities of society.
So vaccine mandates, are you saying if we have a very good contact tracing system in place, then we wouldn't necessarily need mandates the next time around?
Probably easier to talk about that with lockdowns first, then I'll come back to vaccine mandates.
Yeah.
Now, with lockdowns, a colleague of mine ran the line that had New Zealand had better contact case tracing capacity, that we may not even needed the first lockdown. I think he or she has a reasonable conjecture there, particularly if we'd acted, say, 2 weeks earlier, which, again, is with the benefit of hindsight. But if you now turn to look at Taiwan, they did not have a government-imposed lockdown, and they pulled off the elimination strategy as successfully as we did. They also had a very high mask-wearing culture. So in the next pandemic, if we're more accepting of wearing masks, if we're more able to work from home, if the schools are better set up to teach the kids more from home, we can probably have more people out and about moving around without having the mandatory lockdowns for the same type of virus. Of course, if the virus is much worse, it's a different kettle of fish. Returning to the vaccine mandates, there are three types of them. There's the ones that the government puts on people in healthcare, people at the border, customs, staff working in prisons. From our view as a commission, they were entirely justified. Then there's the mandates which came in place because employers wanted to do something under the workforce legislation, as they're required to consider, to protect their employees. And you had a lot of employees saying, I'm only coming back to work if everybody else is vaccinated. And this thing grew out of control. It's not something that I would recommend that New Zealand allows to happen next time. The third type of mandate is the vaccine passes, the passes you needed to go to the pub, to go into a shop, that sort of thing. When that system was designed, which was about October, November 2021, it actually made a lot of sense. Then along came Omicron. And because Omicron wasn't as responsive to vaccines and the vaccine didn't stop you transmitting it to the next person as much, that the underpinning for that was less. Had you had a time machine and known that what was coming up, you may not have designed such a strong vaccine pass system. We don't know what the exact virus is going to be next time, but we need to be even better at thinking about all the scenarios in advance the next pandemic and thinking, okay, this package will probably work best for this type of scenario, this package for that scenario.
Wage subsidies, would they be something that should be considered the next time?
Yes, if you've got a pandemic that's running right and you need people to stay at home and you need a wage subsidy system, yes.
Border closures?
Absolutely essential for that virus, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and is something we should be ready to use again very quickly in the next pandemic. If exactly the same circumstance happened again next year, I would hope that we'd close the border even sooner, so we used an exclusion strategy rather than an elimination strategy and didn't even need the first lockdown. But you're only going to use it for a serious one, and it is an essential part of the toolkit. And maybe, it didn't work this time around, but maybe in the future we'll be able to do home quarantine with better electronic surveillance.
But say if there was a big pandemic I don't know, in the next 5 years, how prepared are we here in New Zealand? Are any of these recommendations from your report on how to prepare for the next one, are they in place already?
So I'll take that as two questions. How prepared are we? And then have any of the recommendations been implemented? Well, we're a lot better prepared because we have recent practice. Not that you'd wish that upon us, but that's what happened. And there are some legacy effects that are positive. So, for example, there is now a National Public Health Service, which has one unified contact tracing database, which makes a lot of difference. That means you can get up to speed a lot quicker. So we are in a better place, but we're nowhere near as well prepared as we could be. As far as the recommendations of our report, we crafted those recommendations as though we were the final report of a Royal Commission. But we've been turned into a phase 1, and there's a phase 2 at the moment. So some of the high-level recommendations, like the central agency function within government to do risk management and a national pandemic plan, to my knowledge, that hasn't started. However, a lot of the separate government agencies have, thankfully, seen our recommendations, seen which one were attached to them, and just gone on and started getting on with it anyway, because they know it's the right thing to do. So there is stuff happening in a reasonably devolved manner at the moment. So that's good, but it's not as good as it could be if there's a central government response to our report.
But as you say, we're going to have to wait until next year to find out which of these recommendations, or if the government's going to implement all of them.
Yes, and you'll probably have to wait till the end of next year, because if the timeline we recommended in our report, we suggested that a minister is appointed to be in charge of the response to the recommendations, that minister reports to Parliament every 6 months on progress, and also then does a full report in a year's time. So it will take time to respond to that, but maybe that timeline can be sped up, because the public sector certainly have had at least 2 years by then to be having our report in front of them.
But Mark Dulder says recent funding cuts to science are already hurting preparations for the next one.
It has a really big effect, is what scientists I've spoken with have told me. Sean Henty, the COVID modeler, we all remember him. He's an example of his Te Pūnaha Matatini, the Centre for Research Excellence, was originally funded back in 2014. Infectious diseases was one of the focus areas. Then their budget was cut by 40% before they'd even opened, and the infectious disease program was left on the cutting room floor. Wow. Imagine if at the start of 2020 we'd have had 6 or 7 years of research into infectious disease spread in New Zealand and modelling that and so on and so forth. We would have been so much better equipped for what was coming. And so these cuts have real impact. ESR lost more than 50 staff to funding cuts last year. They were crucial to the genomics and the tracking of COVID cases for 2 years during that elimination period, which is, when we saw our greatest successes. And it goes more broadly than the science cuts as well. The public sector cuts to the health system. A quarter of the public health service, which was newly set up under the last government, a quarter of the jobs there are set to go. And that's when the Royal Commission is saying we need to scale up our investment in public health.
I mean, we've got bird flu, feels like it's just around the corner. And so if there was one that happened soon, we're basically not ready for it.
There are a few ways that we are better off than we were in 2020, and there are many ways that we're worse off. You look at the health system, the backlogs there, some of that coming out of COVID for sure, but that's way worse than it was in 2020. On the other hand, we do have a national contact tracing IT system. Hopefully it will get the funding it needs to stay updated, but if a pandemic were to happen tomorrow, we'd be able to scale that one up pretty quickly. What about testing labs, though? A lot of them have shut down, funding's been cut. We don't know about that. At ESR, some of the genomics stuff has got ongoing funding, and some of it maybe looks a bit shakier. And then you've got the non-health questions as well. We learned a lot of lessons around from the wage subsidy and the economic response to COVID about what to do and what not to do. But how much of that has been embedded into how agencies are thinking about future big events, pandemics or not, that might require an economic response of that type.
That's it for today. Thanks to Mark Dulder and Tony Blakely. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by Ben Pearce and produced by Gwen McClure. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite anō.